August 1915. Gallipoli Peninsula, Ottoman Empire. Private William Beach sat in a dugout 30 yards from Turkish trenches, packing gunpowder and shrapnel into an empty jam tin. Around him, 5 other Australian soldiers were doing the same thing, stuffing tins with explosive, attaching crude fuses made from safety matches and fabric strips, sealing the tops with clay. A British officer appeared at the entrance. He stared at the improvised bombs scattered across the dirt floor, and his face went pale. "What in God's name are you doing?" Billy didn't look up. "Making bombs, sir. Those are unauthorized munitions. Divisional Command has expressly forbidden the manufacture of jam tin bombs. They're dangerous, unpredictable. They work, sir. I'm ordering you to destroy these immediately and cease all production." Billy finally looked up. "With respect, sir, you can order whatever you like. But when the Turks come over the top tomorrow morning, I'm throwing these at them. You're welcome to throw regulations instead. See how that goes." The British officer stood there for a long moment, realized he was arguing with men who'd been in combat for 3 months straight and clearly didn't care about regulations anymore, and left without another word. Before we continue, quick question. Drop a comment and tell me your city, your country, and what time it is right now where you are. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button so you don't miss what's coming next. All right, back to the story. That night, Billy and his mates threw 17 jam tin bombs during a Turkish raid. The crude explosives killed or wounded over 30 Ottoman soldiers and broke the attack before it reached Australian trenches. And the next morning, soldiers from 4 different Australian battalions showed up at Billy's dugout, asking how to make their own. Gallipoli was a nightmare from day one. The April 25th landing put Allied forces onto narrow beaches overlooked by Turkish positions on high ground. Trenches were dug within yards of each other. Sometimes you could have a conversation with enemy soldiers across no man's land. Fighting was constant, close range, and absolutely brutal. Standard British-issue grenades in 1915 were useless for this type of combat. The primary grenade available was the No. 1 grenade. Soldiers called it the hairbrush because of its ridiculous design. It had a long wooden handle with a cast-iron head, looked like something from a medieval arsenal. To use it, you had to light a fuse with a match or cigarette, then throw it. Light a fuse with a match while people are shooting at you. The design was so stupid that more British soldiers were probably killed by their own grenades than by enemy action. The fuses were unreliable. Sometimes they'd burn too fast and explode in your hand. Sometimes too slow, and the enemy would throw them back. The things were heavy and awkward to throw, and you needed matches or a cigarette to light them, which meant you couldn't use them at night or in rain. Australian soldiers looked at these weapons and said, there has to be a better way. The jam tin bomb was invented out of pure necessity by soldiers who understood they needed short-range explosive weapons that actually worked. Take an empty jam tin, pack it with whatever explosive you could scrounge, add shrapnel, attach a fuse, seal it up. But the Australian version was different from other improvised grenades soldiers were making. They actually engineered them. Many Australian soldiers had been miners, construction workers, engineers before the war. They approached bomb making as a technical problem to solve. They experimented with different explosive ratios. They tested various shrapnel types: nails, rocks, scrap metal, wire. They developed standardized fuse lengths that gave consistent delay times. They created manufacturing processes that produced reliable, relatively safe weapons. The standard Australian jam tin bomb by mid-1915 contained about 12 ounces of ammonal or gun cotton, explosives scavenged from unexploded shells or borrowed from Allied stores. The explosive was packed around a core of metal fragments, usually cut-up barbed wire, spent bullet casings, or nails. The fuse was made from safety match heads wrapped in fabric, giving about a 4-second delay from lighting to detonation. The effective kill radius was roughly 10 meters. The fragmentation pattern was unpredictable, but devastating at close range. And they were light enough that soldiers could carry a dozen without being overloaded. Most importantly, they worked. When Australian soldiers threw jam tin bombs into Turkish trenches during raids, people died. When Turkish forces attacked Australian positions, jam tin bombs broke up assaults before they could develop. British military command hated them. The official reasoning was safety. Jam tin bombs were unstable. The fuses were unreliable. Soldiers making them were at risk of accidental detonation. Manufacturing improvised explosives violated regulations about ordnance handling. And most damningly, they weren't approved weapons, which meant if a soldier was captured with one, the Ottoman Empire could legally execute him as a war criminal rather than treating him as a prisoner of war. All of these concerns were technically valid. Jam tin bombs were dangerous. Soldiers did occasionally blow themselves up making them, and the legal status was genuinely murky. But Australian soldiers didn't care. British command was sitting in comfortable headquarters miles from the fighting, issuing regulations based on legal theories and safety protocols, while Australian infantry were dying in trenches because they didn't have effective weapons. When Divisional Command issued orders in July 1915 banning the manufacture and use of jam tin bombs, Australian units responded with organized disobedience. They didn't openly defy the orders. That would have resulted in court-martials and disciplinary action. Instead, they made bomb production underground. Literally underground. Soldiers dug concealed workshops into hillsides and gullies behind the trenches, hidden from British officers' inspections. They established manufacturing cells, small groups of soldiers who specialized in bomb production, supplied by others who acquired explosives and materials. The scale of this operation was remarkable. By August 1915, Australian soldiers were producing an estimated 300 to 400 jam tin bombs per day across multiple battalions. That's over 10,000 bombs per month, manufactured in secret workshops using stolen materials, in direct violation of explicit orders from British command. And British officers knew it was happening and couldn't stop it. They'd conduct inspections, find nothing because the workshops were hidden, and soldiers would just smile and say they'd destroyed all their bombs as ordered. Then that night, they'd make more. There's a documented incident from September 1915 where a British colonel was touring Australian trenches and heard an explosion from a nearby gully. He investigated and found 3 Australian soldiers covered in soot, standing next to what was clearly a bomb-making workshop that had just suffered a minor accident. "What happened here?" the colonel demanded. One of the Australians, barely suppressing a grin. "Cooking accident, sir. Beans exploded." "That was not beans. Very volatile beans, sir. Ottoman beans. Probably sabotaged." The colonel knew exactly what they were doing, but proving it was impossible. And even if he could prove it, court-martialing dozens of soldiers from multiple battalions would devastate unit morale right before a major offensive. So he walked away and pretended he believed the bean story. The technical innovation in jam tin bomb production is actually fascinating. Different Australian units developed specialized variants for specific tactical situations. Some battalions made double-stuffed bombs with twice the explosive charge for attacking fortified positions. Others created daisy chains, multiple bombs linked with short fuses that would detonate in sequence, creating a wall of explosions. There were even experimental versions with white phosphorus for creating smoke screens, though these were rare because the materials were hard to acquire. The manufacturing process became increasingly sophisticated. Soldiers learned to test explosive batches for consistency. They developed quality control procedures. Bombs that didn't meet standards were disassembled and remade. They established supply chains where specialists would trade jam tin bombs for other valuable items like cigarettes, rum rations, or letters from home. This underground bomb economy became so extensive that Australian units actually had informal ordnance officers. Soldiers everyone knew were in charge of bomb production, even though officially no bombs existed. The effectiveness of jam tin bombs in combat eventually forced British command to reconsider their position. During the August offensive, the major Allied push to break the Gallipoli stalemate, Australian units used jam tin bombs extensively. After-action reports documented hundreds of successful uses. Turkish prisoners, when interrogated, specifically mentioned the devastating effect of these improvised grenades. British officers who'd been skeptical started to change their minds when they saw the results. A weapon that killed the enemy and saved Allied lives was hard to argue against, regardless of its legal or regulatory status. By late September 1915, British command quietly reversed their ban. They didn't officially approve jam tin bombs. That would have meant admitting their standard-issue grenades were inadequate. Instead, they stopped enforcing the prohibition and began turning a blind eye to manufacture and use. Some Australian units received actual recognition. The 1st Australian Division's bomb-making workshops were given official status and small allocations of proper materials. Soldiers who'd been making bombs in secret were suddenly ordnance specialists with semi-official roles. But the damage to British-Australian relations was lasting. Australian soldiers learned they couldn't trust British command to provide adequate equipment or support sensible improvisation. British officers learned that Australian troops would ignore orders they considered stupid, regardless of consequences. This mutual distrust would persist through the rest of the war. The Jam Tin Bomb story also highlights a fundamental difference in military culture. British military tradition emphasized following proper procedures, respecting hierarchy, and trusting that headquarters knew best. Australian culture, shaped by frontier experiences and a healthy skepticism of authority, emphasized practical results over procedure. When those two cultures clashed at Gallipoli, the Australians chose effectiveness over obedience, and they were right to do so. The Jam Tin bombs saved lives. They gave Australian infantry a weapon that actually worked in close-quarters trench fighting, and they demonstrated that soldiers on the ground sometimes understand tactical reality better than officers in headquarters. There's a tragic footnote to this story. In November 1915, one of the underground bomb workshops suffered a catastrophic accident. An explosion killed 4 Australian soldiers and wounded 7 others. British command used this incident to again argue for banning improvised munitions, claiming it proved the dangers they'd warned about. Australian soldiers held a memorial service for the dead, then went right back to making bombs. 4 men dying in an accident was tragic, but acceptable compared to the dozens who would die without effective grenades in combat. By the time Allied forces evacuated Gallipoli in December 1915, Australian units had manufactured an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 Jam Tin bombs. 70,000 improvised grenades made in secret workshops, using stolen materials, in violation of direct orders, by soldiers who decided their survival mattered more than regulations. The Jam Tin bomb eventually evolved into more sophisticated designs. When Australian forces moved to the Western Front in 1916, they brought their bomb-making expertise with them. Some of the techniques developed at Gallipoli influenced the design of official British grenades, like the Mills bomb, which became standard issue by 1917. But the real legacy wasn't technical. It was cultural. Australian soldiers learned at Gallipoli that they could improvise, adapt, and solve problems without waiting for permission or proper equipment. They learned to trust their own judgment over distant authority. And they learned that sometimes the right answer is to ignore stupid orders and do what actually works. British command never quite knew how to handle this attitude. On one hand, Australian units were effective. They achieved objectives, held positions, and fought with skill and courage. On the other hand, they were undisciplined by British standards, prone to questioning orders, and seemingly incapable of following regulations they disagreed with. The Jam Tin bomb incident became emblematic of this broader tension. Australian soldiers saw themselves as practical men solving practical problems. British officers saw undisciplined colonials undermining proper military procedure. Both perspectives had some validity, but the Australians had one unanswerable argument. Their methods worked. Today, the Jam Tin bomb story is part of Australian military folklore. It represents the digger spirit, the willingness to improvise, the refusal to accept inadequate equipment, the skepticism of authority that says something can't be done. Whether that spirit is admirable or problematic depends on your perspective, but it's undeniably Australian. And somewhere, in a museum in Canberra, there's an actual Jam Tin bomb from Gallipoli, one of the few that survived. It's a crude thing, this improvised weapon made from a food container, scrap metal, and stolen explosives. But it represents something important. The moment when Australian soldiers decided that survival mattered more than rules, effectiveness mattered more than approval, and their own judgment mattered more than distant authority. 10,000 bombs made in secret workshops, thousands of lives saved, and a legacy of practical innovation that still defines Australian military culture over a century later. If you're fascinated by stories of Australian soldiers ignoring British orders and doing things their own way, you need to watch my video on how Australian diggers created their own battle tactics at Pozieres. British called it insubordination. It's another case where Australians said no thanks to British methods and developed something better, and the results completely changed modern infantry tactics.